looking back at that video about stories that could potentially have been in the Bible, fairy stories, many more spring to mind constantly. But one thing I can't deny is that exercise talking about Jack and the Beanstalk being one of them, or not, as the case may be, that was fascinating. I love the way that atheists engaged with that. Yes, some tried showing that themes could show up, but it was primarily the ones they were pointing out, but more likely going to be cross-references, sort of things like, yes, and this is another section that also references that. Someone once suggested that it could potentially be a parable by Jesus, which makes reasonable sense, though there isn't really a way it could have fitted in. I did break down the bones of the story to give them a chance to help out, because my training under Sarah Rundle was rather exclusive to the job rather than something that I can find here, there and everywhere. I don't know if she does a course on it outside of Heritage, whether she has a video of it or not. But regardless, it's a useful tool to have. A useful string to my bow, as many might say. And understanding how stories change helps me understand how some things in the Bible can indeed be interpreted as oral stories. Which is what most likely these fairy tales would have been at the time, and thus how they could potentially weave into the Bible. The annoying thing is the atheist who posted that little thing was clearly not interested in the philosophical aspects of it, but far more about the dig at Christianity. Hence showing far more of a willingness to make a point and then leave, rather than actually engage and learn. That's why I'm so glad so many people were able to engage positively, rather than just show up, moan and vanish. But we've spoken about Jack and the Beanstalk, and that's only one, and actually a fairly decent one to discuss, hence why I brought it up. I think I remember hearing someone say that if the Three Little Pigs was in the Bible, they would believe it as true. But that's a highly unlikely story to show up in the Bible, because whilst certainly the Bible was for Christians, you got to remember, the people at the time who would have written it were Jews. And they would have still kept the Mosaic laws. Which included not having anything to do with pigs if they could avoid it. You may think, what about the swineherd who Jesus ended up killing all his pigs by filling them with demons? I'm pretty sure that was a Gentile. I'll have to look it up. Or maybe just a Roman of the region. Or another who didn't particularly care about the Mosaic laws. The passages referenced were Luke 15 and Mark 5, where Jesus was exorcising demons into pigs. This is in the region of Gardenia, or Gardenia, or whatever it's called.
Essentially, the majority of the population were non-Jewish, known as Gentiles, and therefore were not required to keep kosher, and thus were able to keep pigs.
What about others? Some might mention Little Red Riding Hood. That one's an interesting one because, quite frankly, I can imagine it, but there's a particular poem for which I'm pretty sure most people will recognise, certainly one line.
Then Little Red Riding Hood said, "But Grandma, what a lovely, great big furry coat you've got on." "That's wrong," cried the wolf. "Have you forgot to tell me what big teeth I've got?" "Ah, well, no matter what you say, I'm going to eat you anyway." The small girl smiles, one eyelid flickers. She whips a pistol from her knickers. She aims it at the creature's head, and bang, 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 she shoots him dead. A few weeks later, in the wood, I came across Miss Riding Hood. But what a change! No cloak of red, no silly hood upon her head. She said, "Hello, and do please note my lovely fairy wolfskin coat."
That itself is quite a remarkable story and a great poem. I remember chanting it many times at school. But it's not something that is likely to show up in the Bible. And certainly not in a way that many atheists would actually expect. Because, well, they're more than likely going to say the Bible is misogynistic, therefore why would they include a girl even being discerning about that sort of thing? If anything, it'll backfire on half their points, if it does. So whilst that particular version, a parody I'm pretty sure, is more than likely to show up in the Bible, it is the least likely version to be accepted by atheists, which makes it interesting. So are there any particular stories that might crop up as biblical fairy tales? Rumpelstiltskin? Unlikely. In fact, going back over the stories of Brothers Grimm, I can only think of two that might crop up. One is Rapunzel, a maiden being taken away, held in a tower, a great hero coming to rescue her, getting blinded for his troubles, and then being forced to wander the wilderness only to meet someone who brought his eyesight back. Sounds familiar? Quite possibly. Could be one of the stories of those who were blind and then Jesus healed them. There are two after all. One was Barabbas, I think it was. No, Bartimaeus, yeah. That would be a useful backstory for him, maybe even a parable. Love, faith, or just recognising someone for certain qualities. Beyond the obvious, beyond the physical, beyond the one most people remember them for. The next is The Fisherman and His Wife. That's an obscure one, and I've only listened to it on our Brothers Grimm, sort of an audio drama thing, not quite. But it's a story about a poor fisherman and his wife who lived in a cottage near the sea. The fisherman was out fishing, and then he caught a whopping big fish. And he suddenly said, "Fisherman, fisherman, please don't kill me. I am a prince who's been turned into a fish," or something along those lines. And he had magic powers. So the fisherman duly released the fish. But his wife got really annoyed and said that if it was indeed a magic fish, he could have given them a wish. So she asked for chickens, ducks, geese, and a cow. Essentially making a small farm. So he went back to the sea, called out to the fish. The fish came along, he gave the request. The fish gave him the wish. Only the wife started getting greedy. First wanting a castle, then wanted to be queen of the whole land, and finally was to the point where she was demanding lordship of all the elements. The sun, the moon, the sky, the sea, the earth. And what did the fish do? He said, "Go home. Your wife is where she belongs." And you know where she belonged? In the little stone cottage they'd originally owned. The castle was gone, her crown was gone, everything was gone. They were right back to where they started. Makes for an interesting moral. That those who find luck can take luck too far. One might call it gambling. It's a useful one, I'll be honest. And it certainly shows that you can't take the will of God or God's grace for granted eternally. No. Especially if you're going to abuse it. That would be a very useful thing to be in the Bible. And it's got themes that will show up. But here's the thing. Unlike Jack and the Beanstalk, Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Rapunzel, or even for that matter, the Three Little Pigs, I haven't heard any other story on that theme. I haven't heard any other story, Brothers Grimm or otherwise, about the fisherman and his wife. So it might be a very local tale, but it's a very poignant one. I'll have to do some research and see if it does crop up, if it was popular. It might just have ground out in modern times, because quite frankly, who wants to hear that you can be too ambitious? Not the people trying to sell the tape, after all. Those are the ones that I would accept. Rapunzel and the fisherman and his wife. But no one seems to mention them. Here's the thing though. It's not particularly fantastical. It just sounds like medieval tales. Sprinkle a little bit of biblical mysticism in there, and it's perfectly fine. They want big stories that are flashy, fanciful, purely fantastical. Though many would say the Bible already is, mentioning talking donkeys, when in fact the donkey of Balaam was in no way communicating beyond what any equid can do with just their body language and what vocalization they have. They don't need to speak in true prose. They don't need to speak the biblical English. They don't need to speak the King James English. They just need to be able to let you know an idea. And that's all you could get from the donkey. serpent. That was back in the day where no one spoke a particular language. So, odds are Adam and Eve were speaking something that the serpent could also communicate in, or they were just more in tune with the land. Add that to the fact that Adam and Eve is more than likely an oral story, and you get the idea. The whole argument about talking animals, putting the Bible to rest as a story, is nonsense. When you understand what you're arguing about, you can understand it. Any other stories that might crop up? Not that I can think of. Not that I can think of at all. There may be more, and if you have any other suggestions, by all means. Did you want to do remember from the... Well, there are two more that I can remember from those Brothers Grimm tapes. One is called Simile Mountain. It's essentially a more Europeanized version of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Where a poor woodcutter goes to, well, does his job, and then out of nowhere comes some bandits with treasure, goes up to a rock face, asks it to open, using a special phrase. It opens. They go in, it closes, it opens up again, they come out, and they come out without any bags of treasure. The woodcutter goes in to find out, remembering the phrase, sees treasure, takes a handful of gold coins, leaves, and then only finds out his brother is trying to rob him again, constantly asking, what's going on? Where'd you get this money? Come on. So he's forced to tell him, and his brother goes off, opens the mountain, goes in, gets locked in because he can't remember the phrase. The robbers turn up and kill him. In short, it's a very similar story throughout. There are differences in Ali Baba. The brothers are named. Now, I don't know the exact dates of when Ali Baba became part of the oral tradition of Arabia, as that's what it is. It's part of the 1001 Nights. A series of stories told by the wife of the Sultan so she can avoid being executed, and eventually he lets her off. If anything, that story shouldn't be looked for in the Bible, it should be looked for in the Quran. I'm pretty sure that's where it came from. The Middle East migrating into Europe, and then the Brothers Grimm picked up tales that shifted it around. They generally kept stories limited to ones where they don't have to give names. So the obvious ones were Rumpelstiltskin, Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, Rapunzel, and maybe the what was her name? Oh yeah, the Goose Girl. one could be an interesting one, a servant aspiring to higher positions. But then again, that does turn the whole dynamic of the New Testament, where the servant should be equal to the master, not the other way around. Not the master being greater than the servant, on its head. So it needs to match up with that. So I'm not sure that would turn up in the Bible anyway. But that's an interesting one. If you have any other suggestions, by all means leave them in the comments. I do notice these rambling videos don't tend to get as much traction as others with more punchier or even controversial titles. But if you want to understand anything that I do in my videos, it's worthwhile going through the catalogue. I will reference and link videos and explain things as best as I can, but if you don't watch them, you won't understand them. So just remember that. So those of you who are watching in full, thank you so much for watching. And remember, just because the Bible has fantastical elements, you've got to remember history is full of amazing things, amazing coincidences, strange quirks that seem completely ridiculous, that no author, living or dead, would ever get away with. Bryce Courtney proved that when he wrote, I don't remember the name of the series, but he called it his Thank You to Australia. It was a historical fiction because he knew full well half the stuff he wrote down would never be allowed in any work of true fiction because people would say it's too contrived, it's too coincidental, when history is just full of it. I should be able to find a reference to things that are included in the roster of people who coincidentally met up, and that's how we got great advances. There's mentioned a lot in Airman by Owen Colfer. I'd recommend checking out the audiobook, that is fascinating. So remember to keep an open mind and be skeptical of people who say, "Oh, if this was in the Bible, Christians would believe it." We know what to look for, and anyone who seriously studies the Bible will tell you what belongs there, what doesn't, and what they will believe wholeheartedly. Stay safe, and God be with you, my friends.